Every time a Christian liturgy is celebrated, various prayers, hymns, and readings must be said or sung, and actions, both practical and symbolic, must be performed by various people. The event will most likely also involve movable objects, furnishings, and special clothing. If we were to limit ourselves to this 30,000-foot view, most Christian liturgies of the Eucharist have a lot in common, whether they are Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. You have a minister leading it, a few persons in supporting roles, the Bible, and some bread and wine. However, unlike papal in-flight press conferences, liturgy does not exist at a distance of 30,000 feet from the ground. On the ground, it is something highly concrete, articulate, and definite. It cannot be generic or vague, but must commit itself to this or that particular path each step of the way. The urgent question then arises, how ought Christian liturgy to be celebrated? Do we make it up as we go along? Do we hire someone to make it up for us? Do we assemble a committee and ask them to prepare drafts and vote on them? Or can we find it already complete somewhere and gratefully take it up, so that instead of wasting our energy on reinventing the wheel, we can devote ourselves to making the most prayerful and beautiful use of this gift? Well, Catholics once had a compelling answer to the question, how is liturgy to be celebrated? In fact, the answer was as rich as it was simple: tradition. We received our liturgy from apostolic tradition developed over centuries of faithful practice. Because the apostles were united around Christ in the cenacle, authentic rites of worship will always have certain features in common. Because the apostles were scattered throughout the world and planted local churches everywhere they went, our rites will also be diverse as Greek and Latin, Coptic and Slavic, Ambrosian, Roman, Mozarabic, just to name a few. But the fundamental intuition or instinct of a Catholic was always to look for tradition so that we could be confident that what we were doing and how we were doing it rested as much as possible on precedent. The precedent of thousands of saints, countless churches and chapels of Christendom, untold armies of priests, monks, nuns, and layfolk. Against this unanimous practice of nearly 2,000 years of apostolic sacramental Christianity, Eastern and Western, it is no small problem that today the answer to the same question, how is liturgy to be celebrated, has become vexed, divisive, explosive. It has become thus for one and only one reason: the normativity of tradition has been repudiated. Those who refuse to be guided by it have fallen into an arbitrariness from which there is no escape, except by still further arbitrary decisions and actions. It is time to get back to a better way of thinking and acting. Ecclesiastical traditions, especially regarding the so-called externals of liturgy and its development over time, must be honored and preserved because they are intimately connected with the content and practice of religion. Catholicism is inherently a religion of tradition. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I have delivered them to you." He writes to the Thessalonians, "So then, brethren, stand firm and hold to the traditions which you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by letter." In his treatise on the Holy Spirit, published in 375, St. Basil the Great writes, "Of the dogmas and messages preserved in the Church, some we possess from written teaching, and others we receive from the tradition of the apostles, handed on to us in mystery. In respect to piety, both are of the same force. No one will contradict any of these, no one, at any rate, who is even moderately versed in ecclesiastical matters. Indeed, were we to try to reject unwritten customs as having no great authority, we would unwittingly injure the gospel in its vitals." St. Basil helpfully tells us the sort of thing he has in mind, and if we listen carefully, we will hear some examples that may surprise us. Quote, "To take the first and most general example, who is there who has taught us in writing to sign with the sign of the cross those who have trusted in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ? What writing has taught us to turn to the east at the Eucharistic prayer? Which of the saints has left us in writing the words of the invocation at the displaying of the bread of the Eucharist and the cup of blessing? He's talking there about the Eucharistic prayer. For we are not, as is well known, content with what the apostle or the gospel has recorded, but both in preface and conclusion we add other words as being of great importance to the validity of the ministry, and these we derive from unwritten teaching. Moreover, we bless the water of baptism and the oil of the chrism, and besides this, the catechumen who is being baptized. By what scriptures do we do this? Is it not by the secret and mystical tradition? Nay, by what written word is the anointing of oil taught? And whence comes the custom of baptizing thrice? He means plunging someone in three times or pouring 3 times. And as to the other customs of baptism, from what scripture passage do we derive the renunciation of Satan and his angels? Does not this come from that unpublished and secret teaching which our fathers guarded in a silence out of the reach of curious meddling and inquisitive investigation? Unquote. Such quotations from the Church Fathers can be easily multiplied. The Fathers see Christianity as a social and hierarchical religion in which the apostles and their successors have been entrusted with dogmas, liturgical practices, and moral judgments that are intended to be passed on faithfully from one generation to the next. They are speaking about the concrete content of the revealed faith as well as the practices that enshrine it and perpetuate it. These we must approach with the right disposition of soul, namely the humble receptivity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But let us take a step back and ask, why did our Lord set things up this way, with tradition as our guide? There are 2 basic reasons. First, because it harmonizes with our human nature. Second, because it harmonizes with the Church as the mystical body of Christ, a social body in which the members depend upon one another and share goods with each other, not only here and now, but across all the ages and for all eternity. This supernatural interconnectedness of Christians in the Church is founded on, and to some degree mimics, the natural dependencies of human persons upon their families, neighbors, friends, and compatriots. Man is a tradition-constituted animal. The source in human nature of tradition is man's place in the hierarchy of being. Man is more self-transcendent than what is beneath him. Plants have no consciousness at all, so they have no capacity for transcendence. Brute animals do have consciousness, which enables them to be aware of things and of things other than themselves, but their consciousness is confined to material singulars, without the ability to produce out of them a higher synthesis, that is, a continuous texture of time as a field in which thoughts and free actions occur. Man, in contrast, has the power of rationality that integrates the multiplicity of sense experiences into a tapestry of meanings, intentions, communications, and reflections. Rationality makes possible a true self-transcendence, which allows man to live diachronically, that means across times, across eras, not as an orphan or a prisoner of the moment. Tradition is as natural to man as moral and intellectual virtue, and, like virtue, tradition not only makes human life more human and more happy, it carries with it obligations. Just as our rationality implies and impels us to virtue, and we are answerable for our vices, so too we have a duty to remain connected to our natural and supernatural heritage. Man's reason is, in fact, traditional in nature and cannot be otherwise. We see this in how we learn language, which pre-exists us as something handed down to us, and also how we belong to a family, a people, and a nation prior to any choice we make as individuals. To enter into already existing bonds of affection with others, to inherit a body of knowledge and wisdom, to be immersed in a culture, is native to rational animals. We can therefore expect grace to build on nature and for the supernatural life to function analogously. We have a heavenly fatherland or patria of which we are citizens. We have a language, customs, rites, doctrines that we receive. As Thaddeus Kaczynski puts it, quote, Authentic traditions, both natural and supernatural, embody and transmit the ultimate realities of man's existence, the transcendent origin, end, and meaning of things that cannot be grasped by the isolated individual and cannot be fully rationalized or defined. Ultimate reality must be experienced through and in its incarnation in tradition. It is in this sense that tradition is the eye that allows men to see the spiritual, eternal, and transcendent meanings hidden in the physical, temporal, and mundane facts of everyday existence." Unquote. Kaczynski's words are an apt description of what we mean by culture. That is, if I can dare to hazard a definition of that loaded term, culture is the shared ways in which a society or people is accustomed to expressing, celebrating, and perpetuating its vision of reality. That's what culture is. A Catholic culture is the culture that a society is inspired by the faith will produce and cherish, an environment that turns the mind of man to God gently and frequently, making a full use of the high beauties of fine art and the rugged genius of folk art, the impressive pageantry of ceremonial and the stabilizing force of rituals. Such a culture shapes the space and structures of the time in which we live, work, rest, play, fast, and feast. It points us to common goals and ultimate goals, to personal aims and collective aims. We can say without exaggeration that we owe a good part of our identity to a certain collective memory, the continually renewed remembrance of who and what we are, and all the cultural forms that embody this remembrance. This identity is not primarily conceptual or intellectual, but dwells in concrete, visible, audible, tangible expressions that serve as prompts for self-knowledge, incentives for confident action, and supports in turning to God, or returning to Him if we have fallen away. And this is all rather abstract, so let me give a fine example of what I've been describing. If you've been to Europe, you're familiar with the shrines found on every street, nearly every street corner, where a pedestrian is likely to see as he walks through town a Madonna and Child, a patron saint, an archangel, a crucifix, and so forth. These things, scattered throughout a European town, do not make someone into a believer, but they remind a believer of who he is, whom he should turn to in time of need, and pattern himself after at all times. If he has gone astray, such concrete symbols may prick his conscience and induce him to go to confession. Because man is a rational, linguistic, and artistic animal, born into a family and a people with a history of which he is a part and a native language, he is necessarily also a cultural animal. To the extent that man is deprived of a rich cultural inheritance or inherits it only piecemeal, he suffers dehumanization, a denaturing that leaves him feeling incomplete, fragmented, disoriented, unmoored. The inability to draw freely upon a heritage wider and deeper than himself is a serious handicap, a wound, a form of poverty. In like manner, and for much the same reasons, man is a liturgical animal. The liturgy, after all, is the highest rational, linguistic, and artistic activity vouchsafed to us in this life, and also the one most truly social or corporate. It is the activity par excellence of the Church as the family and people of God. It is the most sublime expression of the interiority of man, as well as of his sociability rooted in a common history. Since religious rites are not something we make up as we go along, but something we are meant to receive as our most valuable possession, it follows that not to receive a rich inheritance of the sacred liturgy from our forefathers is contrary to both our social nature and our supernatural dignity. In my experience, however, modern Western people, especially those who live in big cities or who live semi-permanently in the subterranean habitat of the internet, are so cut off from traditional culture and the collective memory that they often look at you with a skeptical eye or a blank stare if you tell them that it is better to receive something handed down from tradition than to make it up yourself as you go along. It is by no means obvious anymore to moderns that it is essential, not accidental, to human beings in general and to Christians in particular to receive rather than to invent their identity, language, and culture. While it's obvious that we inherit much of our identity, it's also possible for us to try to break away from our inheritance and strike out on our own, like the prodigal son, seeking to make our own way in the world, constructing a new culture or a new paradigm, as the progressives in the church like to say nowadays. "I'll do it my way," crooned Frank Sinatra. And why not? Why is this wrong? Couldn't someone say, as long as a pope or a bishop has the authority to create something new that seems more relatable or accessible or helpful to us, why shouldn't he just go ahead and just do it, as Nike advises? After all, that's how it is with science and technology. We chuck out version 1.0 to make way for version 2.0. Why should we feel compelled in the area of liturgy or spirituality or fine art to take what was appropriate for people a long time ago and keep using it, conforming ourselves to it, as to a Procrustean bed? So that's the kind of objection someone might make. It seems to me then that the central question about tradition is as follows, and subsequently I will use X, the letter X, not to stand for Twitter, but to stand for any traditional way of doing something. So that's what my X stands for. Why should the fact that X was done for a long time be an argument that we should do it now? Let me arrange my response from the most superficial to the most essential. The first point that occurs to any traditionalist is something like this. If X was done for a long, long time, then it clearly worked, and it worked in a lot of very different circumstances. Precisely because X was done for so long, no alternative to X has been tested anywhere near so thoroughly. Of the options, X makes the most sense. That's a decent argument, but our objector thinks that modernity is so radically different from every previous set of circumstances that human beings have faced that he doesn't think X has actually been tested over a wide enough variety of situations. Compared to modernity, he thinks, all of antiquity and all the Middle Ages put together are just one giant situation called the old days, or way back when. He thinks like this. We have had two situations, modernity and everything before modernity. So the fact that X worked for one of the two situations is no argument that X is best for the other. This mentality is perfectly conveyed in a memorandum from the Concilium, the body of experts in charge of the liturgical reform. In this memo dated September 9th, 1968, they wrote, quote, "It is often impossible to preserve either orations, prayers that are found in the current Roman Missal, that is the Old Missal, or to borrow suitable orations from the treasury of ancient euchology. Indeed, prayer ought to express the mind of our current age, especially with regard to temporal necessities like the unity of Christians, peace, and famine. In addition, it seems to us that it is not always possible for the Church on every occasion to make use of ancient orations, which do not correspond with the doctrinal progress visible in recent encyclicals, such as Pacem in Terris and Populorum Progressio, and in conciliar documents such as Gaudium et Spes." Unquote. So basically, we can't use all of the ancient prayers because they no longer correspond to modern times. That's the argument. There are many other such memoranda in the archives of the various groups of the Concilium and in the articles published by their members, but they all amount to the same claim. Modern man, you have to make that with capital M's and a trademark, modern man is so different from man of any other age that he might as well be a different species. The food of the past is not the food of the present or of the future. Concerning the text I just quoted, Matthew Hazel comments, quote, "Half a century on from the liturgical reform and the optimism of the conciliar age, it is difficult to believe that liturgists really considered modern man so unique that, for example, the prayers for peace contained in older missals and sacramentaries were deemed entirely unsuitable for the modern age. Of course, advances in military technology mean that particular ethical considerations are more prominent in our day, such as whether the use of nuclear weapons in any way can ever be morally licit. However, if there is anything we should have learned in the last century, It is that modern man is fundamentally the same as man ever was, sinful, wretched, and in dire need of the salvific grace of God." Unquote. I'd also like to point out that the view that these modern times are radically different from all previous times fails in its culpable ignorance of literature and of history. Or maybe not ignorance, but maybe just lack of consideration. The fictional or semi-fictional figures of literature and the real persons of history amply show the sameness and continuity of human nature and its exigencies. Think about Achilles, Paris, Nestor, Helen, Aeneas, Dido, Anchises, Roland, Dante, Beatrice, Portia, Iago, Hamlet, Don Juan, Quixote, Faust, the Bennet sisters, Tess, Micawber. All of these figures are human, all subjects of the same virtues and vices, all, in the contemporary expression, relatable. The permanent things Russell Kirk speaks of are permanent because human nature does not essentially change. We couldn't read anything from history or literature and understand it if that weren't the case. Now, sometimes the difference between modernity and everything before modernity really is a reason to do something new. Our objector has a point. But he has grossly overestimated the difference between modernity and pre-modernity when he concludes that this first argument, that we should do X because it's been done for such a long time, is no argument at all. To say tradition has proved itself over time and has no serious competition is an argument with some weight, even if it isn't decisive. Here's a second approach. Tradition helps us to know more than we would otherwise be able to know, and to develop our capacities to a much greater extent than if we were cut off from it. This can be seen most obviously in the case of traditions of fine art and craftsmanship. Any artist worth his salt knows that he has to master these traditions before he can innovate well. Innovating within a tradition makes his work more substantial and more serious. Just as modern young people who are told to be themselves and be different often end up talking and dressing exactly the same way as everyone else in their peer group does, so artistic convention is so pervasive a fact that even artists who are told to be original end up producing extremely similar products. Andre Gushorst Moore observes, quote, "Art in schools today will likely follow secular modernist conventions in which pupils are encouraged to be creative and express themselves, at which point they inevitably imagine modernist works reflecting the free-floating self. Convention cannot be easily escaped. Man cannot create ex nihilo and can only imitate. And so the question appears of what to copy. In a Catholic and Benedictine context, one would hope for models from nature or from sacred art. The nearest human beings can come to the Creator and his genuine creativity. The Christian imagination will be fostered and educated by the best models if it is to become truly free and capable of being new. Forms and conventions help us to see truly by bringing shape and form to an otherwise undisciplined human imagination." Unquote. Again, trained philosophers know that one can philosophize well only within a tradition, not as if philosophizing is the mindless repetition of what has been said before, but because one benefits from being steeped in what has been argued before, so that one can deepen and broaden one's own range of ideas and situate one's insights within that larger context. It is not for nothing that Robert Maynard Hutchins and Mortimer Adler described their famous series, The Great Books of the Western World, as the Great Conversation. For indeed, every thinker, poet, or intellectual of any kind in the West has entered into a living conversation that began long before him and will continue long after him. Even nihilists, deconstructionists, and absurdists depend on the tradition they critique or parody. And for those who attempt to ignore the tradition altogether, their very lack of engagement with it cannot fail to be noticed, like the embarrassing silence of someone who has nothing to say when addressed with a question or a challenge, or maybe like an emperor with no clothes. The only way to avoid the only way to avoid entering the great conversation is either to rise above it in mystical silence and union with the God who is beyond human words, or to sink beneath it into bestial grunting, shouting, and screaming. In the arts, that latter result takes the form of cheap sensationalism or effete political gesturing. To be human is to be attuned to other men, to be a copier of great models, to be a partner in conversations that extend beyond our minds, conducted in languages that pre-exist us. It should come as no surprise that something so integral to man's nature as divine worship will also be tradition-bound. Patrick Owens explains this point well. Quote, "It is education that conserves and transmits the experience and wisdom of the previous generations so that such a cultural memory, identity, and common parlance can be forged and strengthened. Indeed, for most of human history, this enculturation has been a primary purpose of education. Language encapsulates the culture and the history of a society. Those elements are passed to the successive generations through the language so that future generations may benefit from the sufferings and discoveries of their forebears and enjoy the comfort of participation in a transcendent community that reaches back through the ages. Rightly conceived, culture is the conscious ideal of human perfection and the habitual vision of greatness." I want to repeat that line from Patrick Owens. Rightly conceived, culture is the conscious ideal of human perfection and the habitual vision of greatness. In the case of Catholic culture, this community originates with the apostles and our Lord himself. The language that provides the divine office with its poetic freedom and simultaneously constrains the prose to prescriptive ancient norms, he's talking, of course, about Latin, carries in its rich history an immense treasure of thought and feeling from both pre-Christian and apostolic times. For the better part of 2,000 years, it has provided the Church with a language of worship, an intellectual clarity, and a mark of Catholicity." Unquote. Those who are proposing X, who are saying we should keep X, let's say the Latin Mass, and value it, are in possession of the ball, or to use a different metaphor, they hold the high ground. The very fact that X has been done for a very long time, whether X is the study of Aristotelian logic and metaphysics, or training in calligraphy and draftsmanship, or the offering of the Mass ad orientem in Latin, shows that it is part of a common stock from which we draw when we try to express who and what we are as men or as Catholics. To say we are dependent on tradition in order to become most fully ourselves is an argument. Again, not a demonstration, but an argument in favor of X. Does it follow from this that one can never do anything new in art, in philosophy, or in liturgy, or that one should never attempt it? No, and there has never been any age that did nothing new in these areas. But it does follow that whatever is new should relate itself to and make the best use of that which is old. The innovator says the most when he is in dialogue with the tradition, which acts as the context and contrast for what he contributes. But one can go deeper still to a third approach. It is simply good for us to be in contact with people who lived before us and who are related to us by different kinds of relationships. I know a fellow who is living in the house his great-grandfather built. Whenever he mentions this to others, the reaction is spontaneous and always the same. "How cool is that?" or words to that effect. What's more, he practices the same profession as his father, who practices the same profession as his father, who practices the same profession as his father, all the way back to that great-grandfather. And people usually say, "Wow, that's wonderful, that's amazing." Is it necessary? No. But do we see it as a good? Yes, we do. I know another fellow who makes homemade pasta using the same recipe as his grandmother, who moved over to the United States from Italy. He does it because it's great to do it. The pasta tastes good, yes, it has to pass the taste test, but it is also simply good to cook with the same recipe as his grandmother. The reason this is so instinctive, so instinctively recognized as good, is that our social nature, the nature whereby it is good that we are not alone, but in society, is inherently time-bound. Our instincts are telling us not that it is good to be only with our exact contemporaries, those who are exactly our own age, but rather that it is good for our lives to overlap with the elderly who went before us and the young who come after us, and to be ourselves young now and elderly later in company with others. This same instinct tells us that it is good to have children, descendants, and that it is good to have ancestors. We cannot satisfy our social nature by living in contact only with those alive at this exact moment. And yet, that is where we find ourselves in modernity. Our lives typically resemble the lives of our forebears so little that when we think of it, we might feel lonely. Loneliness arises when one does not live with others. Spouses who cannot have children experience a grief that can be hard to understand until we grasp it as a kind of loneliness. But our language doesn't have a word for the special kind of loneliness of living with no contact for present or future descendants. Similarly, people whose lives are simply cut off at every turn from the past, from their heritage, experience a kind of loneliness too. For lack of a word proper to it, this feeling is often called nostalgia, and that may be adequate if we mean nostalgia in its original sense as a cosmic homesickness. Modernity has a tendency to place us only or primarily with our peers and contemporaries. We see this in public education, where all the pupils in a class are the same age, or at the workplace, where there is usually not so much variety and where innovation is the buzzword, not tradition, or on TV and in the media, where a certain type of adult youthfulness is taken as not just the prime of man, but the only moment worthy of attention. Babies and the elderly are socially ignored or hidden away or seen as burdens rather than blessings, because they draw us into the past and into the future. The loneliness of man as a social and cultural animal is overcome only by being in regular contact with our forebears and with our posterity in the many ways this can take place. The fact that we are cut off from the past in so many ways makes it that much more important to make contact with the past in our religious practices. Because Catholicism is and is meant to be experienced as a strong, visible community, Catholics live out man's social nature precisely as Catholics. Because of the communion of saints, the Catholic society is inherently trans-temporal. It crosses the ages. The saints of the past, living in the presence of God, are contemporaries of us who live in God's grace. But they are precisely the personalities they were. They are not, so to speak, updated, as in the aggiornamento called for by John the 23rd at Vatican II. Just as the one who lives in his great-grandfather's house and the one who makes pasta with his grandmother's recipe love the house and the pasta not only because it's good, but because it has a history, and the history belongs to all of the family as intangible spiritual property. So too, Catholics live in the house of faith and prayer that our ancestors built, and we prepare our supernatural recipes with the same ingredients and techniques they used. We want to pray in the same words the saints used when they prayed. We want to pray in the postures they prayed in. This is just something we intuitively know is good. It isn't something that needs to be proved. The tremendous break between modernity and pre-modernity at nearly every point of life has led, I'm going to argue, to an astonishing loneliness in our times. But modernity cannot process the experience as loneliness. Why is that the case? Modernity's hallmark is rational management from the third-person perspective. Scientific objectivity is what they call it. And when you insist on the so-called view from nowhere, you have no way of accounting for things that can only be seen from somewhere. So we deal with this problem through what I will call substitutes for tradition. We produce sentimental novels or movies or TV shows set in the past. Those are the most popular ones. We research our ancestors with powerful online tools and gain lots of head knowledge about our family trees and birth certificates. We might even collect old black and white photographs. We have reference books about the saints. In such ways, we try to compensate for the loss of actual connections with the past, such as the house to be lived in that was built by the great-grandfather, or the recipe to be cooked from, or most importantly, for this context, a liturgy and devotions to pray from. But head knowledge can never truly substitute for heart knowledge, any more than knowing about God can substitute for knowing God, being intimately united to him in love. At the start of the Bible, God says of Adam, "It is not good for man to be alone." When he creates Eve, he does not create merely a companion, for that might collapse into mutual solipsism or reciprocal egoism. He creates the origin of a family, a tribe, a village, a people, a nation, a church. When he creates Eve, he's creating all of those things at the same time, in her and in them. It is not good for man to be alone, to be confined to himself, his own world, his own time period, his own generation, and its perspective. It's no better to be confined to a very particular time period of the past, such as the 60s or the 70s. They haven't gotten the memo yet about that in Rome. It is good for man to look out and look beyond, to look backwards and forwards, to look above him to eternity and around him to all generations, past and future. In this way, he overcomes his original solitude and the curse of loneliness. The authentic Catholic attitude is one of grateful receptivity to an inheritance, piety for our ancestors, humility in the presence of monuments, not the woke cancel culture type idea. We trust that God has directed in broad lines the worship of the Church in every age, and that the resulting cumulative richness of tradition is eminently good, desirable, beneficial to us, and worthy of attentive discipleship. We are in the position not of masters and owners, but of pupils and tenants. Tradition, especially what we call immemorial tradition, something so old that no one can point out where it began or remember who started it, reminds us of, and even makes present in a certain sense, the eternity and immutability of God. There's a reason Scripture talks about the everlasting hills. They've always been there and always will be, as a kind of permanent, even unchanging backdrop to the changeable round of daily human life. This is why participating in a liturgical rite that looks and feels ancient, as the traditional Latin Mass does, is not a form of LARPing. I'm sure you know what I mean by that, live action role-playing, an imaginary visit to a remote past, but instead removes us from our confinement to the present and makes us breathe a different kind of air. It lifts us above the temporal, the ephemeral, the realm of the works of our hands that are perpetually being improved, revised, repaired, rejected, replaced, like all of the umpteen versions of the iPhone. Other things being equal, I would maintain that traditionalists find themselves less lonely and less lost in modernity, more connected and more contented, because in fact they are experiencing the past as present, tradition as mine and also yours and everyone's, an inexhaustible transmitted content that carries us out of ourselves and out of the prison of the present, the modernism of the moment. We are, so to speak, living in our great-grandfather's house, which is also ours. We are eating our grandmother's food, which we know how to make. We are living in the rambling mansion and spacious fields God has provided for us, rather than an efficient but cramped apartment of our own making. The title of my talk uses the phrase, elevated by the past. Although each of us starts off in life as a blank slate, tabula rasa, we are born into a family, a culture, a heritage. The better this inheritance is assimilated by us, the higher is the basis, so to speak, from which we engage reality. The low road, rocky, rough, muddy, difficult, circuitous, is the road of the man with little access or attachment to tradition. The feral child of the woods, so to speak, and therefore only his own mental equipment and perhaps a few pieces of equipment borrowed haphazardly from others. The high road, dry, smooth, and more direct, is the road made by the wisdom of tradition. The distinction between the conservative and traditional movements within the church, and this is my final sort of area to talk about. The distinction between the conservative and traditional movements within the church is that for the former, the conservatives, tradition is purely conventional, worth hanging on to whenever possible, to be sure, but not intrinsically worthwhile and constitutive of human rationality and society. Conservatism, in other words, is what's left over when one has lost the battle for one's culture. One holds on with a death grip to certain favored externals, to sentimental moments, because the force of life has vanished. That is why Catholic conservatism is often content to retain certain outward signs of tradition, for example, incense, Gregorian chant, and Ad Orientem, without fully embracing their inward reality. The traditionalist movement sees things quite differently. What matters most to us is the integrity of the Mass, that this liturgy be in vital continuity with the past in every step of its growth. The smells and bells, as they're called, enhance the experience and are, of course, part of the same tradition. They are certainly fitting for the occasion, but they cannot substitute for the lack of traditional content in text, music, and rubric. As Martin Mosebach says, an old Latin Mass quietly offered in a garage has more authenticity, more spiritual density than a Novus Ordo Mass done up in a huge cathedral. To understand better what is wrong with conservatism, we need to be aware of the extent to which it already buys into modernity's basic presuppositions. To the extent that the term modernity refers not merely to a chronological period, but to a worldview or a set of beliefs or a range of commitments, at their extreme form, ideologies. We must say, without mincing words, that modernity is predicated on the rejection of tradition, not just various traditions, but tradition as such. That is, the humble and grateful reliance on the cultural patrimony received from our forefathers. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, famously makes the repudiation of tradition and the trust in his own reason alone the basis of his entire philosophy. And every modern thinker after him has done the same thing to one degree or another, even though they are all trapped in an inescapable meta-contradiction because they can think and speak only in a language they have inherited from a cultural context. The only exceptions in the world of thought are those like the Thomists, who expressly ally themselves with a pre-modern tradition, a pre-Cartesian tradition, and who thereby gain the reputation of being, to one degree or another, anti-modern. The 19th century socialist reformer Alexander Herzen distinguishes between two types of reformers: those who stand in judgment over the past, but have weak knees and end up sentimentally rescuing or tolerating some of it, and those who, with a Nietzschean will to power, find satisfaction in thoroughly smashing up the past and cleansing the present of it. His description of the former type may remind us of such figures as John Paul II and Benedict XVI, while his description of the latter will remind us eerily of the mentality and actions of Pope Francis. So this is a quote from Alexander Herzen. "People are afraid of their modern logic, and, having rashly summoned to court the church, the state, the family, and morality, good and evil, they endeavor to save some scraps, fragments of the old. But there are those who, more in keeping with that logic, discard the last ballast of the past and march boldly forward. In passing from the old world to the new, one can take nothing along. We are to be executioners of the past. To us is left the task of persecuting and identifying the past, no matter what disguise it assumes, and of executing it and laying it on the altar of the future." Unquote. Fantastic quotation. Conservatism is nothing other than a slow motion version of the same liberalism that rejects tradition. For conservatives wish to keep this or that particular tradition while generally accepting the modern stance against the great tradition in its totality. Put differently, a conservative is one who wants to keep pretty pieces of the whole, but not the whole itself, and who puts the pieces ahead of the whole. For example, a conservative Catholic will say he loves ad orientem and incense and chant at Mass, but he does not want the liturgy that gave rise to and perfectly suits that orientation and that chant. He may not care what the priest is saying when he is facing ad orientem, whether it's the Roman canon or the pseudo-Roman, pseudo-Eucharistic prayer of pseudo-Hippolytus. As far as he's concerned, the sweet smell of incense is more important than a lex orandi that reaches us unbroken from the earliest centuries of the Church. In this way, the conservative is also entirely modern in his picking and choosing, as from a superior platform, what elements of tradition are to be retained and which ones jettisoned. The results are usually arbitrary and incoherent to those who are familiar with the tradition in its fullness. We who appreciate, who love the Church's tradition, and here I'm talking not only about the liturgy, but about everything she has received from the hand of divine providence, and indeed the sum total of all cultural goods that precede the present moment. We are fighting a battle of unprecedented and even unimaginable proportions. Everyone is against us. The modern secularist governments that try to erase their own Christian history, modern industries that rely on people being mindless consumers with no moral bearings, modern media that drown their addicts in a continual flux of largely useless and heavily manipulated information, quote unquote, and shockingly, a large part of the hierarchy of the Church, which, like Pope Francis, explicitly repudiates tradition, seeing every earlier phase of Catholicism as a mere stepping stone or prelude to the latest and greatest development. Basically, everyone in the modern world has become habituated to think of change and progress as the only goods, and to think of tradition as superseded, either practically irrelevant or actually repressive and dangerous. Because this entire view is profoundly false and harmful to the Catholic faith and to human life itself, we must be serious about rejecting it and living as best we can according to the truth. If that means living temporarily at odds with the Church's hierarchy, so be it. No one ever promised that the hierarchy would be immune to cultural contamination or ideological infiltration. And when we see that such has occurred, we must keep a respectful distance. Obedience to the truth is also and always obedience to received and approved tradition. Only in and by modernity have these fraternal twins, truth and tradition, ever been separated and opposed to each other. Coming now to a conclusion. The spiritual and cultural inheritance of Catholicism is not just window dressing or the icing on the cake. It is the primary carrier or vehicle of a social religion. The Catholic Church is a societas perfecta, a perfect society that lives, moves, and has its being from apostolic tradition and the multitude of ecclesiastical traditions that sprang forth from it, in the way artistic accomplishments rise from generations of trained artisans. Adhering to this patrimony is not easy in a revolutionary age, but the alternative is absorption into the world, cultural apostasy, spiritual amnesia, a frightening loss of identity, of meaning, of values, and of direction. We are living in a strange in-between time, a time of rebuilding and restoration in the teeth of official disapproval. In spite of the fact that Catholicism in its fullness overcomes our existential isolation, men and women seeking to be traditional Catholics today may find themselves suffering an accidental loneliness. Individuals here or there may have a hard time meeting like-minded co-religionists, or finding a spouse who shares their ideas and their devotions, or locating a tradition-loving monastery, diocese, or convent. These are real problems that cause real suffering, yet in their nature they are temporary. The rebuilding of the bridge between past, present, and future is already happening all over the world. It will take a few generations to make the bridge strong again. Meanwhile, the modernist or progressivist form of Catholicism is greedily consuming itself. It does not have the wherewithal to endure. If what I have argued is true, it is self-contradictory, like a battery running down with no possibility of recharging. It that is the modernist or progressive form of Catholicism, it has positioned itself in guaranteed isolation, loneliness, meaninglessness, and despair. It may seem that everyone is against us, but tradition, the democracy of the dead, is on our side. Truth is on our side. That means ultimately God is on our side. There is no reason for despair. There is reason for courage and clear commitment. Catholic tradition is alive again in our midst, bringing new life to a world out of date. Thank you for your kind attention. Yeah, it's a tricky question because you're always at a disadvantage when you're talking to somebody for whom the great tradition is foreign, is alien, and yet you've experienced it, you've come to understand it and to appreciate it, and after a while you come to realize why it makes sense. But it's an apprenticeship, really. I mean, the whole point of my talk is that we have to be schooled into our traditions. We have to be apprenticed to them. And that usually takes a whole lifetime, but it certainly takes a whole childhood and youth. To learn a language, to learn literature, to learn history, and then to learn the traditions of the Catholic faith. All of this takes time. And so it would be wonderful in a way if you could give it to somebody in a tablet form, but it just doesn't work that way. But what I would say, and what I have said to people like that is, well, you could say something like, this is the way that all the great saints prayed. You love Padre Pio, right? And you love Saint Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, and you love Saint Edmund Campion, don't you? Or the Jesuit martyrs, Saint Isaac Jogues, and what about Saint, you can mention thousands of saints, right? Anybody before 1970, approximately. They all prayed this way, so it's really a wonderful thing to come to experience as a Catholic, to share the experience that they had and to be nourished by that the way they were nourished by it. So that might be, for somebody who takes saints seriously, and certainly a lot of pious Catholics do, that might be a really good argument. Another thing that can be said is, with regard to the music, Gregorian chant might seem strange to you, but God is strange too. And come to think of it, a lot of things that we believe as Catholics are rather strange. And so maybe there's some kind of secret conspiracy here where strangeness is part of it. And so why don't you just let us do the chant and see what effect it has on you as it sort of washes over you. And oftentimes, at least in my experience, oftentimes, people who hear chant well done in a situation like that, they'll say something like, "That was so soothing," or "That was so prayerful," or that was really interesting, or there's some positive aspect there, not just a negative one. So those are some things I would say. As for the idea of a different religion, it does actually seem sadly to be the case that, religion, part of my talk was to say religion is not just a bunch of ideas. Religion is a bunch of concrete embodied practices. And in terms of the sum total of concrete embodied practices, Catholicism has changed radically. And I think that that's a problem. That's never happened before. Catholicism has changed slowly over the centuries. In the early church, everybody stood for communion. But by the time you get to the early Middle Ages, in the West, people are kneeling for communion. So that's a change. But the change happened very slowly. And then once people knelt for communion, they did that for over 1,000 years, right? So there's a kind of slow change. It's almost like a glacial change or like a geological time frame, or really slow change. So I'm not saying changes can never happen or should never happen, but actually the reason why certain Eucharistic practices developed is because the faith of the people in the real presence intensified, and they wanted to find new ways to express that faith. So something like kneeling, which is a sign of humility, of self-belittlement, of receptivity. You're on your knees, you're opening your mouth, to be fed, like a baby bird opening its mouth for the parent bird to to put the food in. I think that these things grew out of a deep piety, and so there's a reason why our developments occurred the way they did. And you can see that what happened in the 1960s and 70s primarily, but not only in those decades, was very violent. It was very sudden and very violent, and it was driven by ideas that were not compatible with Catholicism, or at least some of the ideas were not compatible, right? So we're dealing with this very strange situation where we have a great tradition that has a rationale to it, and then we're dealing with a kind of pseudo-tradition, something that's been around long enough that the young lady you're talking about can say, oh, I like traditional music, and she means like St. Louis Jesuits or something like that, right? So that's a pseudo-tradition, right? And that can happen. That can happen. You can have a sort of parasitical tradition that accompanies a real tradition, but doesn't have real continuity with it. Yeah. Sometimes the people who, certainly the people who hurt you the most, are not the ones who are most openly your enemies, but the ones who are closer to you, who should be your allies, and turn out not to be your allies. In other words, the friend who betrays, rather than the open enemy, right? And so I think, if what I argued here is true at the end of my talk about the difference between conservatism and traditionalism, if I'm right in saying that there is this difference, then conservatism is a sort of cloaked and maybe even self-cloaked, cloaked from itself version of liberalism. And it leads certain people who hold to it to take positions that are very anti-traditional, right? So actually, I do think in a lot of ways, conservatives can be, well, the open modernists and the open progressivists are so obviously not Catholic in what they say and what they're aiming for, that we can all identify them more easily. Is the way I would put it. With conservatives, it might seem as if they're fellow travelers, but then we find out that they're actually not committed to the same program that we are. Right? However, conservatives can easily convert to traditionalists, right? Whereas modernists are probably never going to do that unless there's some kind of act of God. And so a conservative who actually realizes, you know what, I'm actually being kind of inconsistent and incoherent and arbitrary. I think I need to re-examine my principles, and I need to just accept the whole tradition, right? That's an easier move for a conservative to make than for a modernist or a progressive. Yes. So it's interesting, the example that you gave. For a long time, at least in my experience, I spent many, many years attending the Novus Ordo. In my experience, most people would go up and and I'm talking about in past decades, they wouldn't bow or they wouldn't genuflect. They just went and received. And also almost always in the hand. What I definitely noticed in more recent years is what you said, that there were more people who wanted to receive on the tongue, and there were more people who were genuflecting or bowing before they approached the minister who has the Eucharist. And the first thing I want to note is that's actually what the rules say. That is, if you read what the US bishops and what other bishops' conferences have said, they say that before receiving, one should make an act of reverence, of adoration. And so in the traditional practice, that act of adoration was simply kneeling. That was the act of adoration, because you only kneel, in the Gospels, people kneel before Christ when they're, either when they're adoring him or when they're begging a favor of him, right? But they beg a favor of him because, at least at some level, they believe that he can grant it, and usually if you're asking for a miracle, it's a sort of divine profession, right? So there's adoration built into that. There's a famous statement by St. Augustine where he says, though one must adore him before receiving him. If one does not adore him, one would be sinning. He's talking about the Eucharist, right? And so that's the origin of the idea of you must make some act of adoration before you receive communion. That's something that St. Augustine said, and everybody quotes that, that line. it seems to me that there's still a certain amount of incoherence there, though, because really what some people said in many decades ago, and you can still find people saying this today, is that the standing and receiving communion in the hand is a return to an ancient practice, right? That's what they say. They quote St. Cyril of Jerusalem talking about people receiving in the hand. But that's not true, because St. Cyril, when you look at his description carefully, it's not the same way as the way in which we do it. So it's not really a revival of an ancient custom. Plus, that ancient custom is only testified to by Cyril of Jerusalem, and there are other testimonies that suggest other ways of receiving communion. So it was more pluralistic in the early church. It wasn't just one way. And over time, it developed in the West towards kneeling and receiving on the tongue, and in the East, it developed towards standing but receiving in the mouth on a spoon. If you've ever been to Byzantine liturgy, you know what I'm talking about. So in no tradition did the laity ever take the host into their hands. And if that happened in Jerusalem, well, there's a reason it stopped happening. See what I mean? Right? In other words, these, you can find in the ancient church some funny customs that stopped because people realized, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, right? So just because some ancient author says it doesn't mean that it must automatically be right. There is an interesting example that I want to give of a little custom, a little pious custom that has developed in the traditional world. I've noticed this in recent years, of people bowing towards the priest when he walks by. And also genuflecting and making the sign of the cross when the crucifix passes by. And I'm not really quite sure where this originated, but it's quite interesting to me to watch it develop, because it sort of spreads naturally, like a sort of healthy germ, it goes from one community to the next. So it's interesting. I like seeing something like that develop. Right. Well, I guess the simplest observation there is that the popular customs that have survived, for example, in Italian towns where they do races with floats of saints, or where they process around with a giant reliquary and 10 men carry it on their shoulders, and it's a huge honor to carry it. All these sorts of things are popular customs. They're not really under the direction of the hierarchy. I mean, they've been going on for centuries, they have like a sort of autonomous life of their own, right? And they're usually done by sodalities or by confraternities or by, whatever pious groups of people have been doing this for time out of mind. And it doesn't really require a priest or a bishop to say, you guys can do this. It's like, they wouldn't even think of, and I would find it hard to imagine a priest or a bishop who'd ever try to stop something like that from happening if it's been happening for 500 years or 1,000 years, right? But the liturgy is a different domain because it falls under the direction of the hierarchy. And so it was much easier for the hierarchy to bank on the habits of ultramontanist obedience in the faithful, to say, look, this is what the Pope is asking, this is what we're requiring, and therefore everybody does it. And so there wasn't, it's a shame really, because I think that the traditional liturgy is, well, of course, it's much more important than running around with floats of saints or relics or something like that. But because those things just had an autonomous life of their own, they kept going. So those are the bits of tradition that survived because they weren't controlled. And the other parts of tradition that were controlled, not very many people resisted the removal of those things. And that, I think, also perhaps suggests that maybe people were more emotionally invested in the devotions and in the running around with the floats or whatever. And so, I think you can make the argument, some people have made the argument that there was a period of time from probably the Enlightenment, 17th century, 18th century, certainly 19th century, and into the 20th, where there was a weakening of the faithful's understanding of the liturgy and of their dedication to it. And that, I think, is the only possible explanation for why so many could have surrendered so much so quickly, right? It was typically, Benedict XVI says, it was typically the Catholics in the countries where the liturgical movement was most strong, where you had the largest number of Catholics who were upset about the liturgical reform and who wanted to hold on to the old liturgy because they understood it, because they did what the liturgical movement said. They got into it, they learned about it, they read their missals, they knew what it was. Yeah, so that's my thought there. Yeah, well, in many ways, it seems to me that you sort of outlined a response in your question because, although it was St. Louis de Montfort in the, was it the early 18th century who propounded, true devotion to Mary, he himself quotes copiously from older authors. And, all you have to do is look at, some of St. Bonaventure's writings on the Blessed Virgin Mary from the 13th century, or even St. Ephrem the Syrian, much earlier than that. I mean, there's such an abundance of evidence of really a warm devotion to Our Lady, even on the part of the Church Fathers, that really you can say the mode of consecration developed, but the idea of being dedicated to Our Lady and of imitating her and of asking for her intercession is just there all along, including in the liturgical texts, especially the Eastern liturgical texts, which are really over the top with their Marian devotion. So it seems to me that I prefer to see something like that as in the way that Newman sees the development of doctrine, the legitimate notion of the development of doctrine, which is a making explicit of that which is already implicit, is an unfolding of the principles that are already there. Sort of like drawing, it's like in geometry, where you start with certain notions and axioms, and then you just deduce lots of conclusions from those. And it could take a while to deduce. I mean, it takes centuries for geometers to deduce everything that you can deduce from your initial axioms and common notions. But all of those things that are deduced are consistent with each other. They're all just unfolding what's present, in the power of those principles. And so that's the way that something like Marian devotion and Marian consecration, or consecration to the Sacred Heart of Jesus for that matter, those things are already contained the way an oak tree is contained in an acorn. They're already there from the start. You can't say something similar about, let's say, if a person claims that even though the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Church Fathers, the medievals, the popes, all of them were unanimously said that capital punishment could be morally legitimate in certain cases. You can't then say it's a development to say now that's not true. That's not a development, that's just a contradiction, right? So, I mean, the most you can say is the circumstances are not favorable to it, or something like that, where you're not actually saying in principle it's no longer acceptable, but just in practice we shouldn't use it, or something like that, right? So right now, there's really the difference between the development as unfolding of a potential or of a kernel, and then there's development as pulling a rabbit out of a hat, or a mitre for that matter. And those are the two very different notions that we're dealing with. So I do actually think, and if you're interested in my arguments for this, pardon me, I gave a lecture called "Why Latin is the Right Language for Catholic Worship." You can find it online. Rorate Caeli is where I put the text. I do think actually Latin is not a mere accident. I think it's really important for the Western liturgy to be in Latin. All Western liturgies are in Latin with very few exceptions. That is historically ever since basically the 3rd century is when Latin, Christian Latin, became mature enough that the liturgy could be composed in Latin. It wasn't because it was the vernacular, it's because it took a long time for Latin to become sufficiently Christianized and sufficiently elegant in that manner to be able to be used liturgically. But from that point on, it was inflexibly used, and I think that it has many benefits to it, very specific benefits in terms of its unchanging content, its clarity, its poetry, its conciseness, the way in which it puts you into a certain zone of worship in the way that the vernacular doesn't, at least in the West, I think. But there's also just practical problems with, translations are just bitterly fought over all the time, and nobody is contented with a translation. Nobody. Like, if you translated the Tridentine Mass into a sort of Elizabethan English, the way that the Anglican Ordinariate does, well, there are a lot of people who would hate that because, oh, this is Shakespearean English. What are we doing? It's so artificial. And so then other people would want it to be in modern English. And then, do you use, when they were trying to retranslate the Novus Ordo Missal, they had big fights. I mean, it was like it was a bloodbath over that translation because some people were saying, oh, we can't use words like gibbet and ineffable because nobody knows what those words mean. Well, if you take as your standard that the only words you can use for the liturgy are ones that everybody knows in a society that's already barely literate, then what are you doing, And so it just seems to me that there's a wisdom in the church saying, no, this is the liturgy. Here it is, It's in Latin. And the fact of the matter is, under Summorum Pontificum, under the Pax Liturgica, the Pax Benedictina, that many, many priests were, especially younger priests, they were doing the work necessary to learn the liturgy in Latin. Let's put it this way, give you an example. Sometimes people ask, why is it the case in the old liturgy that you either have to sing everything or you can't sing anything? Wouldn't it be better if we allowed incremental singing, where if you can only sing the introit, then just sing the introit and the rest can be said. Or if you can sing the introit and the Alleluia and the communion, then sing that and not the rest or something. Why is it all or nothing, right? But I think that in my experience, the fact that, there's a reason for that because the liturgy is meant to be sung. So you should sing the whole liturgy or you should speak the whole liturgy, but you shouldn't mix and match. So then you have weird things where what you sing takes on a greater importance than the things that you don't sing. And that can cause a certain disproportion or asymmetry in the liturgy. But what I've found in experience is that because there's this high challenge of, well, we got to learn to sing everything in order to have a high mass, then people rise to that challenge. It draws them magnetically towards that challenge. People love a challenge. I think especially people who fall in love with something, they want that challenge. So I think similarly with Latin, when you say to the clergy, look, you gotta just buckle down and learn your Latin, as canon law requires you to, by the way. And so, yeah, and then people will rise to that challenge. So that's my answer to your question. So I always like to say that my crystal ball exploded when Pope Francis was elected Pope, and so yeah, I think that several things are going to happen. The first thing is that there's going to continue to be a precipitous, and I would even say accelerating decline in the Catholic population, practicing Catholic populations of Western countries. That's already happened in Western Europe, but it's going to happen in this country as well. There was already, the mass attendance here took a huge hit after COVID. There's something like 20% of Catholics who were going to Mass are not going to Mass anymore. Our country still has a pretty high level compared to countries in Europe, but it's still declining, and the statistics simply show that the young people are not practicing their faith in the Novus Ordo context. Some of them are, but many of them are not. So I think what's going to happen is more and more church closures, more church consolidations, dioceses going bankrupt, just on and on and on like that. So those structures are falling apart, and they will continue to fall apart. And meanwhile, wherever tradition survives, and I say that in the sense that wherever it can manage to get past the traditionis custodes restrictions, right? That those places will continue to boom, they'll continue to grow, lots of young families, lots of young people, lots of vocations. So I think that in a certain, how should I put it, a hard-fought victory of tradition is inevitable after a long enough period of time. I do also think that the next papacy, I hope I don't eat these words, but I really think the next papacy is not going to be anti-traditional and anti-TLM the way that this pontificate has been. And that's because the cardinals are just thoroughly sick of the way things are being done right now. I know that about many, many cardinals from whom I've even heard some interesting information from cardinals about how just all of them they really want a very different kind of pope next time. Somebody who's more diplomatic, someone who is more tolerant, someone who is more even-keeled, right, less passionate, and somebody who is actually willing to try to really welcome all the people in the church, and not merely talk that way, but actually not welcome some people, and welcome others. So I do think that there's going to be big change coming, even in the Vatican. Yeah. So it's not. I wish that it were going to be an easier path, but I think that's what it's going to look like, at least in the Western world. We can't obviously exclude supernatural intervention, nor should we want to, but I think that even just using the observations of sociology and demographics and human psychology, I think that there's reason for hope, actually. Not an easy hope, not an easy victory, but really powerful forces. Let me just give you one example. Many of you probably have heard this already. In France right now, the number of ordinations in the regular diocesan system structure has been going down like practically without interruption for many decades. And at this point, the dioceses in France are ordaining hardly anybody each year. I mean, it's a pittance. But meanwhile, the ordinations in the traditional communities have been going up at a much higher rate. Institute of Christ the King, Fraternity of St. Peter, Society of St. Pius X, other groups as well. And it's actually just been plotted out that if these trends continue, that in about 20 years, the number of traditional priests ordained will outnumber, it was either that the number of priests ordained that already is outnumbering, but that in a certain period of time, the number of priests who are celebrating the Latin Mass will be larger in France than the number who are not. And that's simply by the demographics, not by any intervention of God. I mean, that is an intervention of God in a sense, but not a dramatic one, right? So I think this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Right? Okay, good. I will thank you all for being here tonight.